You're in the classroom with Cat Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. Today's special guest is Doug Lemov. Doug is a former teacher and school principal and the author of Teach Like a Champion, which has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. Join us in this episode as we explore the everyday decisions that shape teaching and learning, from what teachers notice in classrooms and how they can prepare lessons that support deep thinking for all students. Remember, if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, rate me 5 stars, and leave a review. You're listening to In the Classroom. Alrighty, everybody. So today we're in the classroom with an educator that needs no other introduction. He's one of the most influential educators in the teaching profession, and I'm sure you might have a book that he's written sitting on your shelf. Doug Lemov, welcome to the classroom.
Thanks, Catriona. Very happy to be with you.
Doug, why don't we start with getting to know you and what you were like as a student and what actually made you become a teacher?
I was a highly mediocre student, actually. I had my sister, man, she was a dynamo in school. She was the smart one and the talented one. And, I still remember many of my teachers' reactions when they said, "Oh boy, Becky's younger brother," and boy, weren't they disappointed. But I also, it wasn't as bad as all that, but maybe a couple of things about me as a student. I think I was very attuned to the dynamics of classroom. I think that I had it's probably typical of a fair number of, 14-year-old boys, and that I had an intellectual life that I wished to hide from the world. And so I wanted to do decently, but I didn't want to be known as nerdy. I don't think I fooled anybody, but I would do really silly things like not bring books to class, and then try to take notes on a crumpled sheet of paper with a stubby pencil, because somehow I thought that would confer better status on me with the boys that were better athletes, things like that. So, which is, I think, is also a way of saying that I was very attuned to just the dynamics and the social environment in the classroom. I was also very attuned to the teachers that really spoke to me. I still remember them profoundly and how important they were. And then as I got older and got more comfortable with my intellectual life, I think especially in university, there were some teachers that were just profoundly influential in my life. And I think I took my first teaching job. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But I thought, I would really like to play that role for other people that they had played for me. And so maybe their influence was one of the reasons that I got into teaching in the first place.
I love how you mention that you're incredibly attuned to the dynamics of the classroom, because I would say that one of the biggest things you talk about in your work is about perception and sensibility, and teachers knowing that noise that goes down in their classroom when it's a good noise versus when it's a bad noise. And my question to you is, how can teachers become better at perception? Is it just something that they need to have, or is it a skill that they can build? Can you speak into that for me?
It's such a great question. Honestly, nobody asked that question. It's such an important question, which is decision making starts with perception, which I can't make a decision about something I don't perceive. And so I think that's why video is so important. And I think one of the simplest things is to watch lots and lots of video of classroom, watch classrooms together or watch video. And I think that one of the things about watching, especially video of really effective classrooms, is that it's building a mental model. I think there are a couple of different things that are happening when we perceive things well. But one thing is that what you describe when you have a mental model in your mind of what good noise sounds like in the classroom. You're at the board, you have your back turned to your classroom, there's noise behind you, and you're like, that sounds like it's supposed to sound. And then suddenly the noise changes and you're like, that, I have to turn around. That noise is bad. That is you're comparing your mental model of classroom noise to what you're actually hearing. And mental models, whether they're visual or oral, they are critical that experts make decisions. I was telling the story the other day. I'm a big football fan, and I went to watch a soccer match with a guy who played in the Premier League for 10 years or something, and we're sitting in this box that is, 100 yards from the action, and the players are like ants down in the field, and he's chatting with me and he's talking about his history playing in the Premier League, and suddenly he looks at me and he says, the right back is out of position. Well, which right back? And literally, like, the right back is an ant on the field, and he says to me, he's come too far central. He's facing too centrally, and he's too tight to the outside, to the inside, to the center back, and he's in trouble. And like literally 5 seconds later, someone did a pass over his head, and the other team scored. And so I was like, how did you do that? Spent literally the next 20 minutes just trying to figure out how he had, like, out of the corner of his eye while eating a sandwich and telling a story about someone else, had just like seen this thing that was out of place. And what he said was, I have a mental model for what the back four is supposed to look like. They're supposed to look like a saucer, and the saucer orients and tilts to face the direction of the ball. And so the first thing that happened to me is I just noticed that something looked out of place. And when I realized that something is out of place, then I realized that I needed to look more closely. And I think that this is really how people perceive, which is they have a vision of what it's supposed to look like when it's going well. And then when things aren't going, and for the most part, they're not looking that closely at the details. And then when something flags their attention, they start to look carefully at the details. So I think building a mental model, what can it and what should it look like, is really powerful. I think that can be built by watching a lot of video and discussing the video with people and practicing looking for, like, what are the things that we're seeing here? Vocabulary is so important. The other thing that's happening when we're perceiving is we are comparing what we perceive to our knowledge, our background knowledge. And so much of our background knowledge is encoded in vocabulary. So having a shared vocabulary to describe things that are happening, that the students are engaged. There was a cold call there, and that caused the students to have to express their knowledge overtly as opposed to covertly. Just when I practice talking about classrooms in technical ways, I'm refining my knowledge of classrooms. The other thing that I think is really helpful is when you watch video with someone, you're practicing orienting your eyes, which is what should I be looking at? And that's one of the biggest decisions that teachers make. And there's a ton of really fascinating research on this, which is like brand new teachers, if you show them a video in a classroom and ask them what happened, they will often be wrong. Right? It's just so much to look at, and their eyes are darting around. They don't really know what to look at. They will actually often not be able to recreate the events of the classroom accurately, which just tells you how hard it is to perceive a classroom. And how critical that is to teacher decision-making. And generally, I think it's underrated in the development of teachers, which is let's practice watching really good classrooms together a lot. So we understand what makes them good, and we're used to seeing them, so that when things are suboptimal, something flags for us and we look a little bit deeper. And we're like, well, why aren't all the students engaged in learning right now? And it's
I love that so much.
Sorry, long answer, but good question.
No. And I want to build on that in a sense, because in preparation for our podcast, I was actually watching your Teach Like a Champion workshop in Austria, and you showed this video of Maggie and the wait time in class, and you were unpacking this one particular scene of where a student puts her hand up and then she puts it back down. And then you got everybody in the room to just analyze what was going on in that moment. And for me, that just changed my whole perception about who we ask in a class. Why is it that we are so drawn to that first person that puts their hand up, and how can we be rethinking that? And so my question to you is, when teachers are trying to observe a video of themselves teaching, let's say if it was wait time or just a short segment, what are some key pointers that we should be looking at when it comes to let's say checking for a student's understanding?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really challenging question because there are so many things to look for. And I think one of the things to do when you're looking for a video is to narrow your field of vision. Like, I think this is a really interesting video that you're describing, Maggie Johnson's wait time video. It's such a beautiful video. And when I first showed that video, I would show it all the way through and say, what do you notice? And then I'm asking people to do a retrospective analysis, which is I'm asking them to look for things that they may not have actually been looking for during the video, and now trying to remember things that they sort of perceived and sort of didn't. And so I think that one of the reasons that video works now is because I pause it multiple times and orient people's attention to pay attention to just one or two things, right? And so I think just narrowing your field of vision, if you tried to watch for everything in that video, you wouldn't get as much out of it. But if you're watching specifically for the concept of wait time, and trying to read and understand the student behavior. I mean, what's so interesting is just, that video is really an exercise in perception, which is when I show it, there's sort of three different pieces to that video where I just ask the teachers to watch the behavior of individual students and ask me to think about, well, how do teachers typically react to this? How should they react to this, right? There's one student who has their hand up before the question is even out of Maggie's mouth, right? Like, we should notice that. Then like, right, yeah, exactly. Like, what happens if we call on this kid constantly, not just here, but over time? And so I think just one of the keys to seeing more is narrowing your focus and, kind of orienting your attention to focus on one thing. And, like I think one of the most useful framings for the classroom is the idea of ratio, which is I want to be thinking about who's doing the work, right? So I often put this on like an X and Y axis. So the Y axis would be the degree of like think ratio, which a good proxy for that is desirable difficulty. Who's thinking hard about the meaning of the learning object? Or like how much hard thinking is there about the meaning of the learning object? And then on the x-axis is what I call the participation ratio, is like what portion of the kids are doing that throughout the lesson. And just that framework, I think, is a very useful general tool for looking at a lesson. Is there desirable difficulty? What percentage of kids are participating in it? When I was a brand new teacher right out of university, I was an English major. I love to talk about books. And so like I probably asked pretty hard, rigorous questions about the book, but there were like 2 kids in the classroom that were answering those questions. And the rest of them were, like checked out and probably like wanted to stab themselves with a fork. So the challenge for me was, how do I keep the rigor of the questions, but engineer the classroom so that everyone feels accountable for, socialized to answer every question in their heads as I'm asking it, or on paper, or with a classmate as we asked it. And so maybe that idea of like ratio is the best overriding framework, because it kind of combines the like cognitive science, so desirable difficulty, with the social science of like what are the cues and the norms and the incentives that cause people to want to or feel like they should pay full attention.
And over time, I've noticed that in your work, it's become much more deeply connected to the research around the science of working memory, cognitive load theory, and retrieval practice. And this sounds like a huge question, but what ideas from cognitive science would you say have challenged your earlier thinking about teaching?
Yeah. Well, I think clearly the thing that I had wrong when I was a teacher, and even when I was head of school, was I did not understand the importance of background knowledge to critical thinking. And I think that that's chronic in the education sector. And so I believed in the idea of transferable skills, that we could teach students to make inferences by having them practice making inferences. And that we could teach critical thinking in the abstract. And I think in reading the cognitive science, I've come to realize that is, you can only think deeply about things that you have knowledge about, that if we want students to do critical thinking, giving them knowledge is the best way to do it. They're just, I think the data is overwhelming on this. Quick, Catriona, have a deep thought about particle physics. Go. Actually, maybe you can. I don't know. But I don't know anything about physics. So, or so we only can think deeply about things that we have knowledge about. And I think that I didn't understand that when I was a teacher, certainly, and even when I was a school leader. And I think that's the single biggest thing that I've learned in the course of studying teaching.
I think your work touches on that in a sense for teachers as well. Like, there are so many different knowledges that teachers have to know, whether that's knowledge of content, teaching, theory of learners, of school context, and of the politics of teaching as well. One thing that you talk about a lot is teachers being prepared with that intellectual preparation, the role of that. How would you say, I guess my question to you is, what advice would you have for teachers in trying to build intellectual preparation for teaching or for their content? Yeah.
That's such a good question, because I think one of the least understood things about teaching, you were referencing the cognitive science, and I told you the thing that I learned most, but I think the single most important concept in cognitive science for teachers to understand is cognitive load theory and what happens when working memory is overloaded. For students, certainly, but also we should recognize that as teachers, our working memory Just a quick summary of it for listeners who may not know, working memory is the site of your conscious thinking. So if you're conscious, like you're aware that you're thinking about something, you're using your working memory. It's an incredibly powerful tool. It's the site of the great insights of humankind, penicillin, and, the works of Shakespeare, and et cetera. We are able to come up with those insights because of the power of our ability to think about and wrestle and manipulate ideas. But working memory is tiny. You can really think about one thing at a time. And when working memory is overloaded, a couple of things happen. You forget if you try to think about too many things at a time, and your perception is degraded because we use our working memory to perceive things. And so I think one of the most overlooked things in the classroom is that teachers' working memory is always under duress when they're teaching, right? You're teaching 30 students and you're trying to observe their progress as they, do 4-step math problems, and you're trying to attend to their psychosocial needs. And is everyone engaged? How's everybody doing in this classroom? And then you're also trying to attend to your lesson, which is what's next? And do I have time to begin? And I have 30 minutes on the clock, but I planned for 30. There's always more than you can pay attention to. And so one of the most important things to do as a teacher to get ready to teach is to prepare in a way that helps you manage working memory loads when you're teaching. And so I think just distinguishing the difference between lesson planning and lesson preparation is step one. Lesson planning is, what are the topics that I will be talking about? What is the content we'll be looking at? What are the questions that I will be asking? Some teachers do their own lesson planning. Some teachers have a lesson plan given. That is different from lesson preparation, which is a series of habits that I do before I walk into the classroom. And I might have the same lesson with my 3rd period and my 5th period English class, but I might prepare them differently. My 3rd period class is really, really vocal, so I'm going to have to slow them down a little bit. I'm going to have to, I'm going to be thinking about maybe doing a little bit more writing and less turn and talk, versus my 5th period class, which is a little bit more silent. So I want to cause them to talk. So I might prepare the same lesson differently for 2 classes. And I think the most important steps in preparation are, I'll just name 2 or 3 and I think these are just small habits that I should get into. Hopefully I can do them very quickly as a habit. The first thing is that I need to understand that there will be more data than I can hold in my working memory. That if I'm walking around my classroom and I'm watching these 30 students solve 2 problems with 4 steps each, to believe that I can take mental notes on that much data and remember it after I've walked around the classroom, I'm kidding myself. And so I need to just have a clipboard that I walk around with me and I take notes on it. So I'm great. Catriona has a great answer on number 3. And Kevin does not understand number 4. Actually, 8 kids don't understand number 4. This is the thing I need to talk about. I used to do this all the time as a teacher. I would walk around the classroom and let's say you're in my class and I'd be like, oh, Catriona, great answer to number 3. I'm going to come to you and ask you to share that answer with the class. And then I would walk around for 2 or 3 more minutes. I'd engage 6 or 8 kids, and I would forget by the time I got back to the classroom that you had a brilliant answer. And so you'd be waiting for me to call on you for this big moment, and I would have forgotten. You'd be like, what just happened there? Or I would call on you, but I would have forgotten what you said that was so brilliant. So rather than saying, Catriona, you talked about the role of the border states in Lincoln's decision in the Civil War, I would just be like, Catriona, what did you write about? And you would give the best part of your answer, right? And so you would be sort of set up for failure by this. But if I just jot a note to myself, then I'm likely to remember it and come back to it. So just allowing yourself a tool to take notes on the overwhelming stream of data, that is thing number 1 in preparation. And maybe I even want to, the thing that I think you should have in your clipboard is what I would describe as an exemplar, which is a description of the answer that I hope that I will get from students to the most important questions in class. I think it's probably unrealistic to do this for every question in your class. It would be great if you had time to do it, but teacher's time is tight. So, but maybe it's the most important 2 questions that you'll answer during your class. If I write out what I hope students will say, and it's on my clipboard, I can constantly refresh my working memory of it. I can glance down and be like, okay, those are the 3 things I really think are important to say. And so I don't have to try to hold them in my head while I'm also listening to kids. If I'm trying to do 2 things at once, I won't be able to super. And then as they give their answers, whether they're in writing or verbal, I can compare what they've said to what's on my paper. I can refresh my working memory of it. I'll be more insightful about noticing the gaps and be like, yes, but can you say more about this? And just that process of those are tools to support my own working memory. And then the last thing I might have is just for those questions, I might have planned my means of participation. I'm going to have students write for 30 seconds and then turn and talk. And then I'll cold call students in the classroom, and I'll start with a really I'll start with a weaker answer and then cold call someone who's got a really outstanding answer. And then I don't have to be thinking ahead about what the steps that I want to take are, and my mind can be totally present with students. I think the most ironic thing about this is that we tend to think of like preparation behaviors as mechanistic, like I'm trying to script everything that happens in the classroom. But I'm not really. What I'm doing is setting my working memory free to be able to perceive and make decisions. And, like when your working memory is overloaded, your perception will be degraded. Cognitive science tells us that for sure. And so if I want to be responsive to students and listen carefully to what they say and read their body language, I should do everything I can to free up my working memory to do those things with teaching. And so I think those lesson preparation activities, what is it I hope that I'll hear for this question? Where can I gather data? What are the key ways that I want students to answer the questions that I'm asking? I think those things are, those are the real drivers of classroom success to me.
I think you talk about teaching being such a performative profession as well. And that consideration about lesson preparation and lesson planning, they are two different distinctions that we tend to not be cognizant of as much. And so I just want to hear what your thoughts are with artificial intelligence now coming into classrooms as well. And in a sense, offloading that cognitive work for teachers in terms of lesson planning. Can you comment on what you see as the challenges and possibilities in that space of lesson planning and lesson prep?
Yeah. I'm really not an AI expert at all. Honestly, I'm not even that interested. I mean, I know that like you have to have some interest in it because it's the future, but for the most part, I think that it poses more challenge. I mean, it poses some potential benefits in marking student work and maybe giving them feedback but for the most part, I think teaching and learning is a deeply interpersonal interaction between teacher and student. I'm struck by the fact that like almost every time I've used AI for something, there've been egregious errors in it and you can't really trust it and rely on it. So, I think like there are some very simple and practical things that we have to do. We have to recognize that students will use it if we let them. And so I think there has to be a lot more like paper to pencil writing in the classroom as a form of assessment. And that's probably a good thing, that I think people generally speaking are less attentive when they're using information technology. And one of the jobs of school is to develop attentional skills. So I'm a real believer in like low tech, high text in the classroom.
I think you also support, in a sense, a student being able to have the language to understand like how to create a prompt. And I say that coming from the viewpoint of, you talk about building syntactic control, which is about building a student's ability to express themselves and
it's one of my favorite phrases.
Express the nuance in what they say, right? And so can you unpack that for me? Because that is about students articulating their thinking. And so can you unpack that for me in terms of the role of that in the classroom in this age of complexity now?
Yeah, well, I think age of complexity and age when the data on this is overwhelmingly clear. The amount of reading and writing that students do, both in the classroom and out of the classroom, has dropped dramatically. It used to be that you had 3 times as many students if your students were 13 or 14 years old, you used to have 3 times as many students in the classroom. This is like, maybe like the turn of the century, who read daily in their, outside of school compared to kids who never read. And that data has flipped now. You're likely to have 3 or 4 times as many students who never read on their own compared to kids who read regularly. And so this has attentional effects, right? Reading is a attentionally demanding activity. What are they doing instead of reading? They're on their smartphones, engaging in activities that get them constant novel information and sort of socialize them to be distracted and distractible. So their ability to focus their attention deeply on what exactly does this word mean? What exactly does this phrase mean? How do I create a phrase that exactly reflects the meaning that I'm trying to create? those things have been disrupted, both by a lack of reading and lack of writing outside the classroom, and often inside the classroom. Like I think one of the least told stories is the story of how the reading of books has disappeared from English classrooms, and there's less and less writing, and those are like attentionally demanding exercises. And I think that we get better at doing intentionally demanding tasks by doing intentionally demanding tasks. And then I think that you mentioned the phrase syntactic control, which I think is profoundly important, which is I might have an idea, a notion in my head, but my ability to capture it in its depth and nuance depends on my mastery of syntax and phrases. And so often when we ask students to write, they write a series of wooden subject verb object sentences. I think boop, I think bop, I think bink. And the ideas are simplistic because students' mastery of syntactic tools is simplistic, and they struggle to read or write sentences with multiple complex compound clauses where the ideas exist in subtle contrast or one idea subordinated to another. And so I think, it's just very, very important to spend time expanding students' syntactic control, both through reading exercises, maybe like looking very deeply at one sentence and unpacking its meaning and comparing it to a slightly different version of that sentence. This is one of my favorite close reading exercises, called sensitivity analysis, which is we're reading Lord of the Flies. Is a very complex sentence about, early in the boys landing on the island where Ralph tears off his clothes impulsively. And maybe I have students read that very complex sentence with multiple clauses, and then I change a word or two or a word or a phrase in that sentence and say, how's it different when this word or this phrase is changed? And I think there's just a lot of research on comparative analysis that people see more when they compare two similar objects as opposed to when you ask them to analyze a single object in the abstract. So when I do that, I'm really building up students' understanding of how specific syntax makes meaning. And then one of my other sort of favorite activities is what I call developmental writing, which is I might cause students to have to write sentences in different ways. So I might say, great, so when you summarize the boys' changing behavior on the island, start your sentence with the phrase "at first glance," which causes people to have to use an introductory prepositional phrase, first of all, which is like causes me to be able to use them more, but also to think about two different levels of meaning, like the initial and the deeper level of meaning. And so I'm causing them to have to write a single sentence, a sentence that captures multiple ideas. And as we do those things, I think we build up students' syntactic control, which is profoundly important to their ability to create complex ideas.
I think for many teachers listening, they're going to be quite excited by the fact that they might be receiving a mental model of like a language lesson in their classroom tomorrow. And I wanted to ask you this question about the implementation gap, because there is this difference that I've heard you talk about when teachers see something, they get it, and then they want to go in their classrooms tomorrow. And that gap between I get it and I can do it can be quite difficult. So can you speak into that for how teachers can be closing the gap?
Yeah, even just to go back to something as simple as wait time, which you described in the Maggie Johnson video, right? To me, the takeaway from that video is that if I can make a habit of waiting 2 or 3 or 4 seconds after I ask a question, and I don't always take the first hand that shoots up in the air, I level the playing field. I socialize the students to take their time and think more deeply, that it's not a race. And I level the playing field for the students who might want to take their time to answer and who realize that, like, I will never get my hand up faster than David, so I'm going to stop. It's a very profound change from a very simple behavior, which is I'm going to start waiting 3 seconds after I ask a question. But then when you walk into a classroom, and a classroom is an incredibly complex place, where my working memory is overloaded, it's actually incredibly hard to make even a change that simple sometimes in your classroom. You forget to focus on your wait time in the middle of the lesson, or you focus so much on your wait time in the middle of the lesson that other things start to fall apart. Maybe it's probably what you're referring to, the implementation gap. And this is why I think that practice is so profoundly important in teacher development, which is if I want to make that change, if I was a tennis player and I wanted to make a subtle shift in my backhand, I would not deign to walk out on center court at Wimbledon and try and, I would practice it 100 times or at least 10 times before I walked out on the court. And I think that is one of just the most profound things in teaching as a performance profession. You go live in front of an audience. You can't pause and stop and say, well, I want to think about what I'm going to do after I ask this question before I ask it. Can you guys just, to my 30s, my 14-year-olds, can you guys just chill for a second while I think about how I want to ask you this question? It doesn't work that way. So the secret is practice. And I think that's getting teachers together and say, let's practice asking 5 questions that we're going to ask in our lesson tomorrow. Just practice asking it slowly and waiting for hands and, doing what Maggie Johnson does in her video, like smiling wryly while students raise their hand. And maybe they're practicing, ooh, I love the hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Take your time. I'll give you a little bit more time. I want you to think deeply about it. And then I'll ask some of you to answer, just like if I can make some of that habit, if I can automate a little bit of it before I walk into the classroom, I'm likely to be successful. And I'm likely to be able to make the change in a complex environment. So I think the thing to realize is that in an environment as complex as a classroom, even very simple changes often require practice beforehand. And the other benefit of practice is that now when I try it for the first time, in front of students, it will be my 10th time doing it, and I'll sound like me, and it will sound more natural, and it will be much more compelling than if I try to change my behavior for the first time live in front of a group of skeptical 14-year-olds. It's like, well, of course there's a disincentive to do that. I have 14-year-old. I had one, not anymore, but that is a tough audience to perform in front of.
Yeah. Oh, Doug, I wish we had a whole hour together, but half an hour just goes by so fast. So I just loved how you pointed out that idea about practice, because I've heard you quote this quote where you say resistance to change is a lack of clarity to know what to do first. And I think narrowing that vision on what is it that you want to do to practice that for teachers is just so important, that rehearsal. What other ways would you say that teachers should be engaging with their craft as well?
Yeah. Practice is so powerful. It does require often other people. You can practice by yourself, but it requires a partner at least. But I think that's also really nice because it makes teaching a team sport. I think just one of the things that I remember most profoundly about teaching is what a lonely profession it can be sometimes, right? You wouldn't think it would be lonely because you're in a room with 30 other people, with, none of them are your peers. They're 30 years younger than you. It's really nice to get into a room full of peers and practice a little bit, and enjoy it and laugh together, but also be getting better and you feel connected. And I think that's really, really nice. But even, I was just watching a video of a first-year teacher who she just kills. She's so good in her first year. And a lot of what she did was just practice writing out. Honestly, what she practiced doing was writing out her directions, right? Directions are one of those things that's so easy to overlook. But if your directions aren't clear, then the kids don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And they think you're not clear on what they're supposed to be doing. And suddenly students aren't doing it. And so she just would script her directions and practice them with herself before she walked in the classroom. So they were just very natural and familiar to her. And she was really, really successful. I think that doing sort of lesson preparation activities, there's a great American basketball coach who says everyone has the will to win, but not everyone has the will to prepare to win. So having taking the time to do that 10 minutes to write out your exemplar, I think that's really, really important. And then I think the last thing is just one of the things we're realizing about learning is how profoundly important background knowledge is. And so investing in your own background knowledge, you're teaching a novel, take the time to read up on the history of the author and the context of the novel. And maybe even, you read a few articles on it and maybe bring in some excerpts of the articles to increase the background knowledge of your students as well. But if we know that background knowledge makes people more perceptive, more likely to learn, invest in your own background knowledge as a teacher as well, whether that's about pedagogy or even more important about the content that you're teaching.
To close, Doug, what message would you want to leave with teachers who are out there in classrooms doing this work every day?
Well, first, I would just like to say thank you. I think it's the most important work in society. And it's not an easy time to be a teacher, right? There are just immense changes in society that make it's always a challenging job. It's especially challenging now, given, technology changes and, decline of faith in institutions, and people don't trust and admire their schools the same anymore. And, parents are less likely to say to their kids, oh, do what the school tells you to do, whether you agree with it or not. It's a tough time to be a teacher, but it's also a really important time to be a teacher. So thank you is the first thing I would say. And the second thing that I would say is we live in the Prague Spring of cognitive science, right? We've learned more in the last 25 years about how learning actually works than we did in the previous 250 combined. Much of that cognitive science has been slow to get into the classroom. So please read the cognitive science, read the research. It will help you to be more successful. And when you're more successful, you love your work. You deserve to love your work and feel at the end of the day like you won and you did right by students. And so I think in the end, the science will also make teachers happier. If that makes them stay in the classroom for longer, yay, then we've all won.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In the Classroom. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, rate me 5 stars, and leave a review. Don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might find it inspiring. That's all from me, and I'll see you next episode. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.